welcome. It's Sex Talk with Natasha night, Wednesday night, 10 p.m. Central Time. Hope you're joining us. We have a really interesting topic tonight about traumatic brain injury, and maybe some people will be like, oh, that doesn't apply to me. And yet, you know, it's almost 2 million people a year that are affected by traumatic brain injuries of some sort or another. And sometimes you don't even realize that you may be having symptoms from an old injury. So I think that this will be actually really applicable to a lot of people. And we're just excited to have, you know, an interesting topic like this on the show. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that Sex Talk with Natasha is meant to be an ongoing educational experience. It's supposed to be something that you subscribe to and access all kinds of resources that we have going on at the Patreon page. So tonight is just one aspect of Wednesday nights is just one aspect of Sex Talk with Natasha. So we have blog posts, we have daily actions, we have homework assignments, we have affirmations, we have both written things, audio things that I come up with. So just lots of resources to hopefully help you prioritize your sexual health and the sexual relationships that you are currently either enjoying or would like to be enjoying. With that, I will turn the time over to Ashley, our producer, to kind of get us started.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Natasha. Thanks for joining. We're super excited for this topic. Obviously, the topic itself is tricky, so we're not excited about the actual topic, but we're excited to have our guest here and talking more about how we can embrace our own sexuality. So thanks, everybody, for joining. For those that are just joining for the first time, this is an hour-long program. The first 15-20 minutes or so, Natasha will give us a little bit of education on the topic. And then for 20 minutes or so, we'll bring our guest on and she'll be able to ask questions and tell us her story. And then the last 15-20 minutes or so, we'll go ahead and open it up to audience questions. So if you have any questions at all, go ahead and send them our way. And the first half is going to be free on Facebook. So for those on Facebook, if you want to watch the whole episode, head over to Patreon. It's patreon.com/sextalkwithnatasha, and that's where you can subscribe to get the full episode along with all of the other things that Natasha was talking about. It's a great way to get started with a sex therapist. And again, you get so many resources. And we just want to remind people that if anybody does want to see Natasha professionally, you can go to her online practice, which is Symmetry Solutions, and that's at symmetrysouls.com. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Natasha and we'll just get started.
Well, and one other thing I wanted to just let everybody know is that every month we do a giveaway. And this month, I'm so excited to be giving away the book called Becoming Clitorate by Dr. Lori Mintz. And she's amazing. The book is amazing. So, but this is only for subscribers. So, you know, you have until the end of March to sign up as a subscriber to be entered into that drawing. So make sure you take advantage of that because that's a great book. All right, with no further ado, let's talk about traumatic brain injury, which I'm going to be calling it TBI from here on out so that I don't have to say all of those words all at once. So this is traumatic brain injury, TBI, happens through a myriad of ways. And what it usually requires is some type of blow or jolt to the head that impacts the brain. And like I said, this affects almost 2 million people a year will have these types of injuries. About 50,000 people die from TBI issues a year. And about, I think, 250,000 are hospitalized, either emergency room visits or things of that nature. So this typically happens through falls, car accidents, and sports injuries. Those are probably the most typical ways that TBI issues come up for people. And, you know, oftentimes in the sex field, we talk about our brain being the biggest, most important sexual organ. So you can imagine if you're having issues with your head and with your brain, that's going to have an impact on your sexuality. That's where all of your hormones are going, where all the communication is happening to get your body to do certain things and for your body to respond. So I just want to go over really quickly what might be some of the typical things that you might notice after experiencing a TBI that are sexually related. And probably one of the most typical things would be either a decrease or an increase in libido. And this is your desire. This is your drive to be interested and motivated sexually. And so if there's a decrease in libido, you might not be as interested in it. Sometimes there can be an increase to the point that it, because there's been something affected in the brain, it's now become something impulsive, where even people will act sexually kind of in inappropriate ways that they've never acted that way before. May come on to people in situations that are not appropriate, etc. So that can happen. There can also be a decrease in sexual arousal. And I'll always be reminding you that there's a difference between sexual drive and desire and sexual arousal. Arousal is the physiological part of sexuality. So you may have drive, you may want to have sex, you may be motivated to have sex, but your physiology isn't necessarily cooperating. So this is where you might have some erectile dysfunction if you're a male, or you may have lack of lubrication if you're a female. There's just not the same, your body is not responding the way that it typically would have in the past. There might be difficulty achieving orgasm and climaxing that you notice that wasn't there before, that shifted somehow. And for women, there can be actually reproductive changes as well. Sometimes after TBI, there can be changes in the menses. It can affect, because of that, it can affect fertility, things of that nature. So those are kind of some of the basic things that might be noticeable to those that have experience, or their partners might be noticing some of these things. Now, let's talk about what's happening that these things might be experiencing. So one is that, we've kind of already mentioned this, the brain controls sexual functioning. So if there's a trauma or an injury, that's going to affect your sexuality. Hormonal changes, that's a big part of it. Oftentimes medications used to help with symptoms of TBI can also have sexual side effects. So that's something that you want to be asking your physicians about. There might be fatigue that can be a symptom of TBI. So if you're more tired, feel weaker, those are things that can affect sexuality, obviously. Any problems that have to do with movement. So sometimes after TBI, people might have problems with balance. They might have problems with chronic headaches. They might have problems with just certain movements being painful. And so anything like that can, of course, affect sexuality and the positions and sex positions that you're having. TBI can affect, obviously, your self-esteem. So if you see yourself now as somehow broken or different than you were before, maybe you're having some type of memory loss or cognitive functions that are different after TBI, this can obviously affect how you feel about yourself. And we know that self-esteem and sexuality are closely tied together. There can be changes in thinking abilities. So whether that is your memory, your ability to plan ahead, things like spontaneity, even some people might notice slight personality changes or even severe personality changes depending on how severe the brain injury is. About 75% of TBI is considered mild. So not a huge amount of it is necessarily to the level where you see things like cognitive functional changes, but for people where that does affect them, it's obviously life-changing in many ways. And also there can be emotional changes with TBI, such as irritability, depression, anxiety, nervousness, anything of that nature. So those are all the things that can and why they are happening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that you can be thinking about as far as how to manage, or tools that you can have kind of in your pocket as far as thinking about trying to have some solutions to some of these issues. And then we'll talk with our guest and see what she has to say. So number one thing I'll say is make sure that you're talking to your doctors about sexual concerns. Oftentimes, if you're going in to be treated for a brain injury, you're not necessarily seeing a sex specialist. And oftentimes people are either embarrassed or there's some stigma around talking about sexual issues. So many people do not bring up their sexual issues to their doctors. And many doctors do not ask about sexual issues. So you really have to become a self-advocate for your sexual health when it comes to the medical treatment that you're undergoing. Number two would be part of that is make sure that you're getting correct testing for things like your hormones or blood work or anything that could have to do with why your body is experiencing different types of sexual functioning. So again, that's a self-advocacy piece, and asking your doctor correct questions about, how could these meds potentially be affecting me? Should we check my hormone levels? What types of, medical interventions are there for sexual issues, if that's an option, etc. My number 3 point is just taking the time to heal. Oftentimes with TBI, it just does take some time, especially after a concussion or something like that, to just allow your brain to kind of just get back into its normal functioning, or back to as close to its normal functioning as possible. And so sometimes what you're experiencing, especially short term, is not what you'll experience long term, and to try to manage your own anxiety and just allow yourself the time to heal. I know that after concussion treatment, oftentimes doctors are asking people to take it easy, maybe take time off work. That can be hard to do sometimes for people depending on their situation, but really prioritizing your self-care so that your brain can, heal as much as possible and get back to its normal state as much as it's going to be possible. Number 4 point is taking the time to grieve changes that are not going to necessarily shift back. So if you're experiencing some type of long-term effect from TBI, that's going to require some grief work, and kind of adapting to a new normal is kind of how we talk about that in the therapy field. So taking the time and getting the resources, oftentimes with some professional counseling, to help you and possibly your family members as well adapt to what this new life is going to look like if there are longer term effects. The next tip is kind of a long one because it has like sub tips. So number 5 is really being proactive about your sexual life. I have a quote somewhere that I wrote, something about, it's interesting that out of everything in life, we don't really leave hardly anything else to chance the way that we do our sex lives. If you want to make more money or have a better job, you go ask for a promotion, or you go to school and get a different degree. You take steps towards getting a better position. If you are grumpy with your physique, you go on a diet, or you start working out and go to the gym, so you do things. You don't expect things to just spontaneously happen. But when it comes to your sex life, oftentimes we're kind of in this space of, it's just supposed to naturally happen. And if it doesn't naturally happen, then there's something wrong with either me or you. And so taking a more proactive kind of solution-focused approach to sexuality is my number 5 tip. And my sub tips are these. So 1 is finding time, scheduling sex. A lot of people are like, well, that doesn't sound very romantic. And I'm like, yeah, neither does a lot of the things that we do in life, right? But we still prioritize them. And scheduling can be very useful, especially if you're dealing with fatigue or medical ramifications from side effects from medicine. So if you take a med that kind of knocks you out at night, well, plan sex in the morning, or plan sex at lunchtime when you're more energetic. Don't just assume it's going to happen, when at the end of the day when you're already exhausted normally anyway. So finding a time of day when you're not tired, when you feel better, when you feel more energetic. B, I guess, is making sure that you're intentional about leaving certain roles behind. So oftentimes a person who has suffered an injury is the sick one. And if they have a long-term partner, they're the caretaker. Well, there's not a lot that's sexy about either being the sick one or being the caretaker. And this is true really of any issue, whether you're dealing with TBI or diabetes or depression or anything, there's usually some issues there. And so really kind of mindfully and intentionally making sure you're taking off that hat when you enter a sexual realm together. And that takes some kind of mental effort and practice to be able to do that. And you may have intrusive thoughts, and we can talk about that a little bit more, you know, as you try to do that, but you usually get better at that with practice. C under this is finding positions that are comfortable and not painful. So maybe the type of sex that you had before with a lot of thrusting or a lot of head movement or even back injury will be painful. And so you may have to get a little bit more creative and find different positions and different ways to have sex that are now enjoyable given your current ability with your body. D would be getting rid of distractions or welcoming distractions, depending on what's useful. So maybe before having the TV on was fine. It didn't matter. It wasn't distracting. But maybe now with TBI, it has like a grading type of effect, or it distracts you from the mindfulness that you want to be enjoying in your sexual experience. Or maybe having background music is actually helpful to not have your, you know, anxiety kind of go a little wackadoodle, or, you know, things of that nature. So whether you need distractions or you need to get rid of distractions, you know, focus on making your space for sex something that is going to be helpful to you and is going to make it more likely that you're successful. The next one I would say is that there's a lot of sexual aids and tools that can help. So if, for example, you're having problems with erectile dysfunction, well, there's cock rings. There's a lot of like really great positioning sex kind of pillows, or pillows are probably not the best way to describe them, but they have lots of great kind of ways that you can position yourself, whether it's by putting something under your back and raising up your pelvis, or a support for your back as you're lying back in a certain way. There's even like slings, swings, there's all kinds of stuff out there that can help you again maneuver your body and find comfortable positions to be able to have successful and comfortable sex. And then the last thing I'll say about intentional tips is using erotica to help with sexual stimulation, because remember, one of the things that we mentioned was the possibility of low sexual desire. And so that's oftentimes you may need more stimulation biologically. Again, remember, so much of what we're dealing with is biology than you did before. And so having certain erotic materials that might help you get aroused and stay aroused can be very helpful. And the last tip, my number 6 tip, is just be willing to get professional help. And I think that there's 2 ways to really think about professional help in this realm. One would be through sex therapy to actually help you with the sexual piece of this particular issue. And then the other would be emotional kind of cognitive behavioral work to deal with some of the ramifications of shifts and changes that you're experiencing because of the TBI. So whether that's depression or change of roles in your family system, or some of the ramifications of the grief work that I mentioned before. So sometimes you can do that with the same person. Sometimes you want specialists kind of in both areas. And I'll link to some organizations where you can find, you know, good professionals in your particular area if you're looking for resources that way. So those are the tips that I have for the subject in general.